This bear doesn't growl, she hugs everyone she meets. The morning frost clung to the windows of Motthorn's farmhouse like crystalline fingers, patterns etched across the glass and delicate whorls. October had arrived with a vengeance in the Willylat Valley, bringing with it the kind of cold that seeped into bones and lingered there, a reminder of winter's approach. Ma, as everyone had called her for so long that even she sometimes forgot her given name was Margaret, pulled her faded flannel robe tighter around her thin frame and stared out at the mist-shrouded trees that bordered her property. 5 years since David had drawn his last labored breath in the bedroom upstairs, the cancer finally claiming him after months of suffering. Sometimes it felt like yesterday, other mornings, like this one, it felt like a lifetime ago. The coffee maker sputtered and hissed, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma that had once been their shared morning ritual. Now it was just another habit, something to warm her hands around while she prepared for another day of work. The work was what kept her going, had kept her going since the funeral, when the well-meaning platitudes and casseroles had finally stopped arriving. Ma moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency: feed the chickens, check on the barn owl with the damaged wing, prepare formula for the 2 fawns whose mother had been hit by a logging truck last week. The rhythm of care was familiar, comforting in its demands. The animals needed her, and that need had become her anchor in a world that had drifted sideways when David died. The phone rang just as she was pulling on her mud-caked boots by the back door. Few people called this early, few still called at all these days. "Thorn Residence," she answered, her voice still mourning, rough. "Ma, it's Sarah from Cascade." The younger woman's voice carried an urgency that immediately straightened Ma's spine. Sarah Donovan was the coordinator at the Cascade Wildlife Rescue Center, the main facility that often referred special cases to Ma's smaller operation. "What's happened?" "We've got a situation. Black bear cub, male, about 5 months old, found near the forest edge yesterday evening." Ma's grip tightened on the receiver. "Poachers." "Looks that way." Forest Service found dried blood, tufts of fur in a sprung iron trap. No sign of the mother except, well, evidence that suggests she didn't make it. Ma closed her eyes. Despite decades of protection efforts, poaching remained a persistent problem in the national forest. And the cub was in bad shape, severely malnourished, with damage to his hind legs. Might be partial paralysis from trauma or malnutrition, we're not sure yet. Our facility is at capacity with the recent wildfire evacuations. We need someone with experience. "Sarah, you know I don't take predators." The words came automatically, a reflex built from both training and David's firm conviction. "Especially bears. They're not pets. They're not rehabilitation candidates unless they can be fully wild again." "I know, Ma. I wouldn't ask if we had options. But this little guy," young Sarah's voice softened, "he's not going to make it without specialized care. And if there's anyone who could give him a fighting chance." David always said. I know what David said. I also know what David would do if he were here. The silence that followed hung heavy between them. Ma looked around her kitchen at the photographs on the refrigerator, she and David standing beside a released bald eagle, David bottle-feeding a cougar cub they'd later transferred to a sanctuary in Idaho, the 2 of them on their 30th anniversary, his face already gone from the first round of chemotherapy. "I'll take him temporarily," Ma finally said, emphasizing the last word. "Just until he's stabilized and you can find a permanent placement. And I'll follow protocol to the letter. No eye contact, no talking, no human interaction beyond what's medically necessary." The transport team can be there by noon, Sarah said, a sigh of relief evident in her voice. And Ma, thank you. After hanging up, Ma stood motionless in her kitchen. What had she just agreed to? David had been adamant about bears, they're uncontrollable and dangerous, he'd say whenever the topic arose. Wild to their core, and that's how they should stay. But David wasn't here anymore, and a cub was suffering. She spent the morning preparing the isolation enclosure at the far end of her property, a reinforced structure David had built years ago for temporary housing of larger animals. It hadn't been used in years, but the bones were good. She swept out leaves and debris, checked the integrity of the fencing, and set up a heating pad beneath a pile of clean straw. The work kept her mind busy, prevented her from second-guessing her decision. The Cascade transport van arrived precisely at noon. 2 handlers dressed in the center's forest green uniforms carefully carried a large crate into the enclosure. Ma watched from the prescribed distance as they opened the crate door and quickly retreated, securing the enclosure behind them. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then slowly, a small black form emerged from the crate. Ma's breath caught in her throat. The cub was tiny, far smaller than he should have been at 5 months, with dull, matted fur that hung loosely over a frame so thin she could count his ribs. His movements were hesitant, his back legs dragging slightly as he cautiously explored his new surroundings. But it was his eyes that struck her most deeply, dark pools that seemed to hold a sorrow too profound for such a young creature. "We've been calling him the cub, but he'll need a designation for the records," said one of the handlers, a young man with a clipboard. "Milo," Ma said without thinking. It had been her father's name, a strong name that somehow seemed to fit this fragile being. "Milo it is," the handler noted. "We've left the medical supplies and feeding schedule in the prep area. Dr. Reeves will be out tomorrow to check his progress." After they left, Ma stood watching Milo from outside the enclosure. He had retreated to the farthest corner, curled into himself as if trying to disappear. Following protocol, she avoided looking directly at him as she quietly entered to leave a small bowl of specialized formula near the entrance, then withdrew, locking the gate behind her. From her kitchen window, she could see the enclosure. Throughout that first afternoon, Milo barely moved. When darkness fell, she returned with a flashlight, keeping its beam low to avoid startling him. The formula remained untouched. "You need to eat," she said softly, forgetting her own rule about not speaking. She prepared another batch of formula, warmer this time, and brought it to the enclosure. Protocol dictated minimal contact, but the cub was failing to thrive. After consulting the emergency guidelines Sarah had left, Ma made a decision. Sitting on a low stool inside the enclosure, she filled a bottle with the warm formula and waited. An hour passed. The night grew colder. Ma's joints ached from sitting still, but she remained, the bottle cradled in her lap. Finally, hunger overcoming fear, Milo began to inch toward her. His progress was painfully slow, each movement seeming to cost him tremendous effort. When he reached her, he didn't immediately take the bottle. Instead, he looked up directly into her eyes. Ma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of something that had been tightly bound for years. "It's all right," she whispered, offering the bottle. Milo accepted it tentatively at first, then with increasing eagerness as he fed. Ma could feel the trembling in his small body. Without thinking, she placed her free hand lightly on his back, feeling each vertebra through his thin coat. He didn't flinch away. When the bottle was empty, Ma prepared to leave, following the rule about limiting interaction. But as she stood, Milo did something unexpected. He leaned against her leg, pressing the full length of his body against her. It wasn't the nuzzling of a domesticated animal, it was something more primal, the seeking of warmth, of contact, of reassurance that he wasn't alone. Ma froze, unsure how to respond. Then slowly, she lowered herself back onto the stool. Milo remained pressed against her, his body heat mingling with hers in the cold night air. Just this once, she told herself, as she sat with him until he fell asleep. But it wasn't just once. Each night for the next week, Ma found herself sitting with Milo as he fed, allowing him to lean against her afterward. She told herself it was necessary for his survival. Once he was stronger, she would maintain proper distance. The changes in Milo were gradual but undeniable. His coat began to regain some luster, his eyes grew more alert, and though his hind legs remained weak, his movements became more confident. Dr. Reeves, the wildlife veterinarian who visited weekly, was cautiously optimistic. The physical injuries may improve with time and proper nutrition, she explained during her third visit, but he'll likely never have full function of his hind legs. He won't be able to climb trees effectively or outrun predators. What does that mean for his release prospects? Ma asked, though she already knew the answer. Dr. Reeves sighed. It's not looking good. Bears need to climb for safety and food access. Without that ability, his survival chances in the wild are minimal. Ma nodded, feeling a complicated mix of concern and, though she wouldn't admit it, relief. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, she said. For now, we focus on getting him healthy. As October deepened toward November, Milo's personality began to emerge unlike any bear cub Ma had encountered in her decades of wildlife work. He showed no signs of panic or aggression. He was watchful, deliberate in his movements, and possessed a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his young age. One evening, as rain lashed against the enclosure, Ma sat on her usual stool, lost in memories. It had been David's birthday, and the weight of his absence felt particularly heavy. Tears slid down her weathered cheeks as she absently stroked Milo's growing form beside her. Suddenly, she felt a pressure on her shoulder. Milo had raised his paw, now the size of a salad plate, and placed it gently against her. His eyes, no longer dull with pain but bright with intelligence, met hers. The gesture was so deliberate, so seemingly filled with understanding, that Ma's breath caught. "Are you comforting me?" she whispered incredulously. Milo maintained the contact for several moments before lowering his paw, but something had irrevocably changed between them. The carefully constructed barrier Ma had built, both around her heart and between herself and this wild creature, began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, Milo's shoulder taps became a regular occurrence. Whenever Ma was particularly quiet or seemed distressed, the bear would approach and place his paw gently on her shoulder or arm. It was as if he had developed an uncanny ability to sense her emotional state. By December, Ma had to acknowledge what she had been avoiding. She had grown deeply attached to Milo, and the prospect of parting with him, even to a sanctuary, filled her with dread. More concerning, Milo's dependency on her had grown alongside his improving health. He followed her movements with his eyes, greeted her with soft vocalizations when she appeared, and showed little interest in developing the natural behaviors that would be necessary for wild survival. On a bitter cold morning, Ma made the call she had been postponing. "Sarah, it's Ma Thorne. We need to talk about Milo." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I've been expecting this call. Dr. Reeves has kept me updated on his progress. His hind legs aren't improving enough. He can walk, but he can't climb, can't run properly. Ma took a deep breath. And there's something else. He's different, not like any bear I've worked with. Different how? How could she explain without sounding like a foolish old woman who had projected human qualities onto a wild animal? He's unusually responsive to human emotion, gentle in ways that seem deliberate. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You're getting attached. Yes, Ma admitted, the single word carrying the weight of her internal struggle. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I don't think he can be released. She steadied herself. I don't think I can part with him. Ma, you know the complications involved in keeping a bear permanently. The permits alone. I'll do whatever it takes. Apply for whatever licenses are necessary. Build whatever enclosure is required. I have the space, the resources, the determination. In her voice was surprise, even to herself. It won't be easy, Sarah warned. Lifetime permits for keeping wildlife are rare and difficult to obtain. You'd need to build an enclosure that meets federal standards, submit to regular inspections, provide proper veterinary care. I understand. Another pause. Let me make some calls. We may be able to classify him as an educational animal. If you're willing to participate in some outreach programs, it would strengthen the permit application. After hanging up, Ma walked out to Milo's enclosure. He was sunning himself on a flat rock, his black fur absorbing the weak winter light. When he saw her, he rose and moved toward the fence, his familiar lopsided gait both endearing and heartbreaking. We're going to try to make this work, she told him, reaching through the fence to scratch behind his ears. You and me. The permit process was as arduous as Sarah had warned. Ma spent hours filling out paperwork, hosting inspections, and meeting with wildlife officials. She used a significant portion of her savings, money she and David had set aside for retirement travels they would never take, to begin construction on a permanent enclosure. The new space was designed to give Milo as natural an environment as possible while accommodating his limitations. It included a large open area, a pond deep enough for swimming, climbing structures with gradual inclines he could manage, sun-warmed stones for resting, and a cozy den for winter months. Throughout the construction, Milo watched with evident curiosity, often sitting for hours observing the workers. Once, when a construction worker approached Ma with a question, Milo rose to his full height, now considerable despite his young age, and issued a low warning growl. The man froze, eyes wide. He's protective, Ma explained, moving between them. "Mo, it's all right. He's helping us." To the worker's astonishment, Milo immediately settled back down, though his eyes remained fixed on the stranger. "Never seen anything like that," the man muttered. "Responded to you like he understood every word." Ma simply nodded. She had long since stopped being surprised by Milo's apparent comprehension. By spring, the new enclosure was complete and the final permits had been approved, largely due to Sarah's advocacy and Ma's agreement to develop educational programs about bear conservation. Milo's transition to his new home went smoothly, his excitement evident as he explored every corner of the expansive space. With the legal hurdles cleared and Milo settled, Ma found herself settling into a new routine. Her days once again had purpose, but now that purpose was intertwined with the bear who had unexpectedly become the center of her world. She still cared for other wildlife, the injured owls, orphaned fawns, an occasional fox kit, but these were temporary residents passing through on their way back to the wild. Milo was permanent. Milo was home. As he grew into adolescence, Milo's personality continued to develop in fascinating ways. He created games for himself, rolling logs and splashing in his pond. He arranged stones in patterns that seemed deliberately decorative. Most remarkably, he began collecting objects, colorful leaves, unusual twigs, smooth stones, which he would carefully place in a specific corner of his enclosure almost like treasures. One warm afternoon in late May, Ma was working in her vegetable garden when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking up, she saw a familiar truck approaching, Eleanor Whitaker, her closest friend and one of the few people who had stood by her after David's death. Eleanor, a retired librarian with a no-nonsense demeanor that belied her kind heart, had been skeptical about Ma's decision to keep Milo. Bears belong in the forest, Margaret, she had said firmly when Ma first told her about the permit application. You're letting grief cloud your judgment. Now, as Eleanor stepped from her truck, Ma could see her friend's expression was guarded, curious but cautious. So this is the famous Milo, Eleanor said, approaching the enclosure fence. He's bigger than I expected. Milo, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, raised his head at the new voice. He studied Eleanor for a long moment, then rose and ambled toward them with his characteristic uneven gait. He won't hurt you, Ma assured her friend, who had taken an involuntary step backward, but he is curious about new people. Milo stopped a few feet from the fence, sitting back on his hunches to observe Eleanor more carefully. Then he turned and moved to his collection corner, selecting something before returning to the fence. With deliberate gentleness, he pushed a small object through the mesh, a perfectly round stone polished smooth by water, with bands of color that caught the sunlight. What on earth? Eleanor murmured, bending to pick up the stone. Did he just give me a present? He does that, Ma said, smiling at her friend's bewilderment. He seems to choose specific items for specific people. As if to confirm this, Milo pressed his head against the mesh, gazing at Eleanor with those intelligent eyes that had first captured Ma's heart. Well, I'll be, Eleanor whispered, her skepticism visibly melting. He doesn't just understand emotions, he shares them. The stone became the first of many gifts Eleanor would receive during her increasingly frequent visits. Each one seemed carefully selected, a feather with iridescent blue highlights, a piece of bark with an interesting pattern, once even a wildflower plucked carefully from within his enclosure. Eleanor wasn't the only one drawn into Milo's orbit. Word spread about the gentle bear at Thorn's place, and despite her initial reluctance, Ma found herself hosting small groups of visitors, mostly local children and their parents, who came to learn about bear conservation through Milo's story. One such visitor was Leo Henderson, the 9-year-old grandson of George Henderson, whose property bordered Ma's on the north side. George was known throughout the valley for his hatred of wild animals, particularly predators, which he viewed as threats to livestock and livelihoods. When Leo appeared at Ma's gate one summer afternoon, she was understandably surprised. "Grandpa doesn't know I'm here," the boy confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "He says bears are dangerous, but Jimmy at school said, your bear is special." Leo was a small, thin child with solemn eyes that seemed too old for his face. Ma had heard through local gossip that the boy had become withdrawn after his parents' acrimonious divorce the previous year, barely speaking and performing poorly in school. "Well, all bears deserve respect," Ma said carefully, "but Milo is indeed special. Would you like to meet him?" Leo nodded, his expression serious. Ma led him to the enclosure, explaining Milo's story and the importance of keeping a safe distance. To her surprise, Milo, who had been swimming in his pond, immediately emerged and approached the fence when he saw the boy. What followed was one of the most remarkable interactions Ma had witnessed. Milo studied Leo with intense focus, then retreated to his collection corner. He returned with a perfect heart-shaped leaf, which he gently pushed through the fence toward the silent child. Leo picked up the leaf with trembling fingers. "He knew," the boy whispered, looking up at Ma with wide eyes. "He knew I was sad." From that day forward, Leo became a regular visitor, arriving on his bicycle whenever he could slip away from his grandfather's watchful eye. Milo seemed to reserve his most special finds for the boy: a dry honeycomb, a blue pebble that gleamed like glass, a tiny bird's egg that had fallen from a nest. The two would sit for hours, one on each side of the fence, in a companionable silence that seemed to heal something in both of them. Occasionally, Leo would read aloud from books he brought: adventure stories, nature guides, poetry, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each visit. "He listens better than people do," Leo explained when Ma asked why he read to a bear. "He doesn't laugh if I mess up words." As summer turned to fall, Ma noticed changes in Leo. He stood straighter, spoke more readily, even smiled sometimes. His visits became a bright spot in her days, his gentle interaction with Milo a reminder of the unexpected connections that could form across the boundaries of species. It was during this period that Ma began to fully appreciate the depth of her bond with Milo. He had become not just a responsibility or even a companion, but something more profound, a bridge between her isolated grief and the world of emotional connection she had closed herself off from after David's death. This understanding was tested when, in late October, news broke of a disease outbreak affecting the black bear population in parts of the Willamette National Forest. The illness, a respiratory infection that could prove fatal, had wildlife officials on high alert. Milo's vaccinated and isolated from wild populations, Reeves assured Ma during an emergency visit. "But we'll need to be vigilant. Monitor for any symptoms: lethargy, loss of appetite, respiratory distress." Despite these reassurances, fear took root in Ma's heart. The prospect of losing Milo, of watching another beloved being suffer and die, was unbearable. She found herself checking on him obsessively, waking in the night to stand at her window with binoculars, watching the rise and fall of his breathing as he slept in his den. Milo, with his uncanny sensitivity to her emotional state, responded to her anxiety with increased attention. His shoulder taps became more frequent, and he would often press himself against the fence when she approached, as if trying to offer physical comfort through the barrier. One particularly difficult night, after reading reports of 3 more bear deaths in the forest, Ma broke down, sitting on the ground outside Milo's enclosure. She wept openly for the first time since David's funeral, not just for the fear of losing Milo, but for all the grief she had held at bay through years of determined self-sufficiency. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw Milo approach the fence. Instead of his usual gentle tap, he pressed his entire body against the mesh, placing both massive paws as high as he could reach, as if embracing her through the barrier. His eyes, fixed on hers, held a depth of understanding that transcended words. "I can't lose you too," she whispered, pressing her palm against the fence where his paw rested on the other side. They remained that way until dawn broke over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the property, an old woman and a bear connected by something deeper than either could articulate. The disease outbreak eventually ran its course without reaching Ma's property. Milo remained healthy, his days filled with exploration of his enclosure, visits from Leo and Eleanor, And the quiet evenings when Ma would sit by the fence, sometimes reading aloud from David's favorite books, sometimes simply sharing the silence. As winter approached again, marking nearly 2 years since Milo had come into her life, Ma found herself reflecting on the journey they had shared. She was approaching 70 now, her hair entirely silver, her hands more gnarled by arthritis. Milo had grown into a magnificent young bear, his coat glossy black, his frame powerful despite the persistent weakness in his hind legs. One golden evening in late November, Ma sat on her porch, a photo album open on her lap. The pictures chronicled her life with David, their wedding day, the construction of the farmhouse, countless moments with rescued wildlife, their life's work preserved in fading photographs. From his enclosure, Milo watched her, his gaze thoughtful. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, he moved to the fence closest to the porch. Through the mesh, he carefully extended his paw, holding something delicate. Ma rose and approached. In Milo's massive paw was a single late-blooming wildflower, a tiny purple aster, its petals perfectly formed despite the season. "For me," she asked softly, accepting the fragile offering. Milo's eyes met hers, conveying something beyond words, acknowledgement, perhaps, of all they had become to each other. That winter, the final approval came through for Milo's status as an educational ambassador animal. The classification came with requirements. Ma would need to develop formal presentations about bear conservation, host scheduled educational visits, and participate in the regional wildlife education network. "It means more people," Sarah explained during her visit to deliver the news. "More structure. Are you sure you're up for that?" Ma looked toward Milo, who was watching them from his favorite sunning rock. "We're up for it," she said with certainty. Together, in the years that followed, hundreds of visitors came to learn about bears through Milo's story. Children who had once feared predators developed understanding and respect. Adults who had viewed wildlife management as abstract policy saw its impact through the eyes of one bear who had been given a second chance. Milo never became a pet. He remained very much a wild creature with his own distinct personality and needs. But he had become something equally profound, a bridge between worlds, a living embodiment of the complex relationship between humans and the wild creatures with whom they share the earth. For Ma, he had become even more. In opening her heart to Milo, this abandoned bear cub from the forest she had found, she had discovered not just purpose but healing. The space that grief had hollowed out within her had been filled again, not erasing David's memory, but expanding to embrace new love, new connection. On summer evenings, visitors to the Thorn property might glimpse an unusual sight, an elderly woman sitting near a fence, reading aloud from a well-worn book, while a large black bear listens attentively, occasionally reaching a paw through the mesh to tap her shoulder gently, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." In that simple gesture, a bear's touch contained a world of understanding that transcended the boundaries between species, a reminder that connection once thought lost could be found again in the most unexpected places.